She whispered that the book was too wild for most men, but what I discovered was that it wasn't the book at all, it was her. The library was the kind of place most people passed by without noticing: tall stone pillars, a wide wooden door that creaked when pushed open, and an almost sacred stillness inside. I'd come there on a late afternoon, chasing quiet more than books. Dust floated lazily in the golden shafts of light spilling through the windows, and the faint smell of old paper clung to the air like memory. I wasn't expecting to notice her. But I did. She was standing on a ladder near the history section, sliding a thick book back into its place. Her movements were unhurried, elegant in the way only someone who had lived enough years to wear grace naturally could manage. She looked to be about 40, maybe 42. Her hair was pinned up, though a soft strand had fallen loose and brushed her cheek every time she turned her head. She wore a navy cardigan over a fitted blouse, nothing dramatic, yet on her it seemed almost intentional, as though she carried her own quiet authority. I found myself watching her, not just because she was beautiful, but because she seemed to belong to that place more than anyone else I'd ever seen. Every motion she made was deliberate, as though she wasn't just shelving books but protecting them. When our eyes finally met, it wasn't accidental. She glanced down, noticed me standing there, and instead of looking away quickly, she held the moment, steady, assessing. I felt the weight of her gaze in my chest. "Are you looking for something in particular?" she asked, her voice low and even, as though she'd spoken inside the silence rather than breaking it. I nodded, though truthfully, I wasn't sure what I was searching for. "Something different," I said. "Something I wouldn't usually find." That was when she smiled, small, knowing, almost secret. She descended the ladder and walked closer, her heels soft against the carpet. Up close, her presence was even stronger, not because she tried to be commanding, but because she didn't need to. Her eyes studied me in a way that made me feel like she was measuring something deeper than the surface. Then she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to curl in the air between us. "There's a book," she said slowly, "but it's too wild for most men." And with those words, I realized this wasn't going to be just another afternoon in a quiet library. She didn't answer me right away. Instead, the librarian tilted her head slightly, as if deciding whether I deserved to know what she had in mind. For a moment, her silence felt heavier than the library itself. Then, without another word, she motioned for me to follow. Her steps were measured, quiet, yet I could feel the authority in them. She led me past the familiar shelves, the bright, orderly rows where students usually gathered, deeper into a part of the library I had never noticed. The air grew cooler, and the light dimmer, as if we were stepping into a place that hadn't been disturbed in years. We stopped in front of a narrow alcove tucked behind an arched doorway. The shelves here were darker, lined with books bound in cracked leather, their spines etched with faded lettering. Dust lingered thick in the air, and the silence felt alive, as though the walls themselves were guarding secrets. She traced her fingers slowly across the books, pausing at certain titles before moving on, as though testing them, weighing their worth. Then, with a deliberate motion, she pulled out a volume unlike the rest, thick, with a cover worn soft by time, its edges frayed as though it had survived more than one lifetime of hands. When she turned to hand it to me, her fingers brushed mine. It wasn't a long touch, nothing deliberate, yet it carried an unexpected warmth. A flicker of something unspoken passed between us, a kind of acknowledgement that we were no longer just librarian and visitor. Her eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary. And then, in that same low whisper, she said, "This one doesn't reveal itself to just anyone. Don't read it quickly. Don't skim. Let it breathe inside you." I glanced down at the book in my hands. Its weight was real, yes, but what I felt pressing heavier was the responsibility she had just placed on me. I didn't know why her words mattered so much, only that they did. When I looked back up, she was studying me carefully, as if waiting to see whether I would laugh it off or take it seriously. I surprised myself by whispering back, "I'll take my time." The faintest smile curved her lips. Not approval exactly, more like recognition. Then she stepped back, leaving me with the book and the strange, unshakable sense that it wasn't the pages I should be afraid of, but the woman who had placed them in my hands. That night, the book lay heavy in my lap like something alive. I hadn't even reached the first chapter before I found myself pausing, my fingers resting on the worn leather cover. Rain tapped against the window beside me, steady and persistent, filling the silence of my small apartment with its own rhythm. The lamp cast a pool of golden light over the pages, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. But my thoughts kept drifting back to her. The librarian. Every time I read a line, I heard it in her voice, low, measured, with that faint edge of warning that made every word feel more important than it should have. I could almost see her there in the corner of the room, watching me with the same intent gaze she had given me when she placed the book in my hands. I tried to shake it off. Tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that it was just a book, just a woman doing her job. But the truth pressed heavier with each passing page. It wasn't the book that unsettled me. It was her. The story I was reading blurred with the memory of her presence. The descriptions on the page, of wild journeys, dangerous choices, and the kind of courage that demanded a man step outside his safe life, felt less like fiction and more like a mirror she had held up to me. It was as though she'd chosen this book not for any man, but specifically for me. At one point, I closed it entirely and just sat there, listening to the rain. My chest felt tight, not in a painful way but in the way a man feels when something inside him has shifted, and he knows he won't quite be the same again. I remembered the brief touch of her fingers brushing mine, the quiet heat of it still lingering as though she had left some invisible mark. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, and whispered aloud, almost to convince myself, "It's not the book, is it?" No answer came, of course. Just the rain, and the soft hum of the lamp. But I knew. Somewhere deep inside, I already understood, she was the wildness I was holding on to, not the pages. And the more I tried to resist that thought, the stronger it became. The next evening, I found myself back at the library long after most people had gone. Maybe I told myself it was for the book, but in truth, it was for her. The rain had cleared, leaving the air outside cool and sharp, but inside the library the world felt hushed, wrapped in the soft glow of desk lamps. She was there, seated at a large oak table near the back. A lamp lit the pages in front of her, but it was her face I noticed, calm, absorbed, yet carrying something heavy beneath the surface. When she lifted her head and saw me, there was no surprise. Just a small smile, the kind that acknowledged she'd expected this. "You're back," she said, voice low but warmer than before. "I had questions," I admitted, holding up the book. She gestured for me to sit across from her. I lowered myself into the chair, the old wood creaking under the weight of silence that stretched between us. For a while, we didn't speak, only the rustle of pages breaking the quiet. Then, slowly, our words began to drift away from the book and toward life. She told me she hadn't always been a librarian. That once, she had chased a life far louder, full of ambition and people who never really saw her for who she was. "I thought I was too much for some men," she confessed, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her teacup. "Too opinionated, too curious, too unwilling to shrink." Her voice didn't crack, but her eyes softened, shadows of old disappointments flickering there. I listened, not interrupting, letting her words settle the way the rain had settled the night before. "You don't seem too much to me," I said quietly. And I meant it. Her gaze lifted, meeting mine with a searching intensity, as though she was weighing whether to believe me. The silence between us deepened, no longer empty but charged, humming with something unspoken. She reached across the table to adjust a book that had tilted to the side, and in that small motion her fingers brushed against my wrist. It was the lightest of touches, but it sent a current through me. Her hand lingered a second too long before she pulled back. Neither of us acknowledged it. But we didn't need to. In that brief touch, something had shifted, a quiet understanding, fragile yet undeniable. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about a book, or even about curiosity. It was about her letting me see a part of herself she had kept hidden in silence. It was a Thursday evening when I followed her beyond the shelves, up a narrow staircase I hadn't known existed. She carried a small set of keys and moved with a quiet certainty, as if she'd walked this path many times alone. At the top, a door opened out to a rooftop garden I never would have guessed sat above the library. The air was cooler here, touched by the faint perfume of jasmine drifting from potted plants that lined the stone edges. The city lights flickered in the distance, but the rooftop itself felt hidden, a sanctuary where the world couldn't intrude. She stood near the railing, the soft breeze catching the strand of hair that always seemed to escape her careful pinning. The fading light painted her features in gold and shadow. For a moment, I didn't move. I just watched her, the way her shoulders held both strength and fragility, the way her silence seemed heavier than words. When I finally stepped closer, she spoke without turning. "You shouldn't be here." Her tone wasn't sharp, but it carried a weight, a quiet warning. "Then why bring me?" I asked softly. She exhaled, her breath visible in the cooling night air. "Because part of me wanted to. And part of me knows I shouldn't." I leaned against the railing beside her, close but not too close. The city hummed faintly below, yet all I could hear was the tremor in her voice. "Do you care what people think?" I asked after a long silence. She turned to me then, her eyes catching the last streaks of sunlight. "I care more than I wish I did. People notice. They whisper. They judge what they don't understand." And, her voice trailed off, as though the rest of the confession was too dangerous to name. I wanted to tell her none of it mattered. That the world could say what it wanted, and I'd still be here. But before I could, a breeze swept between us, and with it, the loose strand of her hair brushed against her cheek. Without thinking, I lifted my hand and tucked it gently behind her ear. The moment froze. Her eyes fluttered closed for just a second, and in that second I felt her lean into my touch, almost imperceptibly. Her skin was warm beneath my fingertips, softer than I imagined. But then she stepped back, creating a space between us as though it were the only way to steady herself. Her lips parted, and in a whisper that trembled more than her usual calm, she said, "Don't make me reckless." Her words cut deeper than any warning could have. I understood then that this wasn't hesitation born from lack of feeling. It was hesitation born from too much. She was afraid not of me, but of herself, of the wildness she had confessed through silence, and of the way I had begun to stir it awake. I didn't reach for her again. Not that night. I just stood beside her in the cool jasmine-scented air, knowing that some boundaries weren't walls but doors, and that one day, she might open hers fully. The night the storm came, the library felt like a cathedral under siege. Rain hammered against the tall windows, and every crack of thunder rolled through the halls like a drumbeat. Most people had fled long before the worst of it began, but not me. And not her. I found her in the reading room, a pool of lamplight gathering around her as if she'd drawn it there for herself. She was holding the book, the same one she had once whispered was too wild for most men, as though she'd been waiting to return it. "I thought you'd already finished it," she said softly when she saw me. "I did," I admitted, stepping closer, "but finishing isn't the same as understanding." Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. She closed the book slowly, her hand lingering on its cover. Then, with quiet deliberation, she extended it toward me. As I reached out, our fingers touched again. But this time, neither of us pulled away. The storm outside roared, lightning streaking the sky and flooding the room in harsh white light for a heartbeat before plunging it back into shadow. Yet even in that chaos, the silence between us felt louder. Her hand trembled faintly in mine, though her eyes never left my face. "You shouldn't," she whispered, but her words were weaker now, stripped of the certainty they once carried. "I don't think it's about what I should," I answered, my voice low, steady. "It's about what we already feel." For a long moment, we just stood there, her hand in mine, the book pressed between us like a fragile secret. I could feel her pulse beneath her skin, quick, uneven, betraying the calm she always tried to wear like armor. The thunder cracked again, closer this time, rattling the windows. She flinched slightly, and instinctively I tightened my hold, covering her hand fully with mine. It wasn't bold, wasn't forceful. It was steadying, an anchor against the storm. Her gaze dropped to our joined hands, and when she looked up again, her eyes were softer, more vulnerable than I had ever seen them. There was longing there, yes, but also fear. The kind of fear that only comes when something matters too much. "We can't," she started, her voice breaking. "Then tell me you don't want to," I said gently. Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched, trembling, fragile. She didn't pull away. She didn't push me back. She just stood there, letting the weight of the moment wrap around us. And in that silence, with the storm raging, the thunder echoing, the lightning spilling through the windows, I understood. We had reached the edge. The place where hesitation could no longer hold back the truth pressing between us. The storm passed by dawn. When I returned to the library the next morning, the air felt different, washed clean, gentler somehow. The tall windows no longer rattled with thunder but glowed with soft golden light. Students were back, moving quietly among the shelves, their footsteps muffled against the carpet. Yet, in the midst of the ordinary, I felt the echo of what had happened the night before, or rather, what had almost happened. She was there, behind the counter this time, her hair neatly pinned again, her glasses perched just so. On the surface, she looked as she always did, composed, professional, untouchable. But when her eyes lifted and met mine, something unspoken passed between us. A recognition. A memory. A promise. I approached slowly, the old book cradled in my hands. It felt different now, not because its words had changed, but because of everything it had come to represent. Setting it gently on the counter, I said, "It wasn't too wild for me." Her hand stilled on the desk, and for a long breath she simply looked at me, as if deciding whether to let my words reach the places she had guarded so carefully. Then, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders relaxed. She touched the book, not to take it back, but as if to acknowledge the journey it had carried between us. "You read more than the pages," she whispered. "I read what you wanted me to," I replied. The faintest smile tugged at her lips, and it wasn't the cautious, knowing smile she had given me before. This one was softer. Real. Vulnerable. And in that moment, I knew the storm had shifted something inside her as much as it had inside me. She stepped out from behind the counter, hesitating for only a second before closing the distance. The library around us carried on, pages turning, footsteps echoing, but it all faded to background noise as she came to stand in front of me. Her hand lifted, almost uncertainly, before resting lightly against my chest. I could feel the warmth of her palm through my shirt, the quiet steadiness of her touch. Then, with a small exhale, she leaned forward, resting her cheek against me as though testing whether I could hold the weight of her silence, her fears, her hopes. I wrapped an arm gently around her, not pulling her close, but simply letting her know I was there. Present. Steady. Chosen. For the first time, she didn't resist. She didn't whisper warnings or step back into the safety of distance. She allowed herself to stay, just a woman and a man, not bound by years or judgment, but by something quiet, fragile, and deeply human. And in that library, under the soft light of morning, we began not with a storm, not with fire, but with trust. The kind of trust that whispered, "This is the real beginning."